Hey folks, my name is Pat Deegan, and today I'll be giving a talk that I call Why Don't They Just Take Their Meds? I'm beaming in from Massachusetts, and I have a brief bio that you can review. But just to summarize real quickly, I'm a person who was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager. I went on and got a doctorate in clinical psychology, and I've been working for the past 3 or 4 decades trying to change the mental health system so no one ever gets hurt in it again, which was my original mission that sort of came to me during an important turning point in my recovery. So again, thanks for having me, and it's an honor to be here. I've prepared my remarks today so that I can be succinct and so that we have plenty of time for questions and answers. Now, my sense is that all of us today have probably seen a person struggling mightily with this thing that we call psychosis. And I think most of us have observed that sometimes psychiatric medications are effective in helping people steer their lives back on track. And then we probably all have observed as well people who may abruptly discontinue psychiatric medications that seem to be helpful, especially when they have done this more than once, many of us begin to wonder perhaps why don't they just take their meds? And so in my talk today, I want to reflect on this question with you. But to begin with, I want to acknowledge, and it always impresses me when I'm at a conference where there's a wide diversity of groups of professionals and community members in the audience joining together. Because all of us here today have an interest in how to best support people with psychosis. And I'm reminded that in this world where sometimes I think it can feel very fractured and polarized, sometimes here we are coming together as community and really being intent on trying to find ways to improve supports for individuals who are struggling. And I'm reminded that, yes, as humans, sometimes we can achieve something like true human solidarity, true community when catastrophic events occurs, things like earthquakes and fires, etc. And in my experience, in these moments, sometimes as a human community, we respond with enormous generosity. We're stirred by the anguish of people who are suffering, and we can actually see ourselves, in a sense, in the face of those who are surviving. Our compassion arcs like a bridge across the span of all that divides and polarizes us in these moments, and the wider human community encircles the loss, encircles the anguish, and we embrace it and we hold it. So for me, the image is the circle, the human community forming a circle around the survivors, a circle that's stronger and that is more resilient than any one individual can be. A human community forming a circle that holds survivors, a circle that absorbs the tragedy, a human community in this kind of circle of compassion that can lift us higher than any floodwaters can reach. And then from that community, an extraordinary generosity of spirit is sometimes born, and we begin the work of rescue and rebuilding. We even take money from our own pockets, and we send food, waters, and medicine. And the circle that I'm speaking of is unbroken as we begin the work of recovering and rebuilding a life after these floodwaters recede. But when an epic event like psychosis rips through a life, then the human community responds in a very different way. The arc of compassion seems to fall short, and somehow the community does not see itself in the face of those of us who experience psychosis. It's as if the common ground of our shared humanity is forgotten or obscured, and too often we leave people stranded in medication-induced chemical hibernation or state hospitals, the streets or jails, as the floodwaters continue to rise. So instead of one human circle that holds and embraces, two circles are formed. And those of us with psychotic disorders become the other, the not me, or the outsider. The wider human community distances itself from those of us diagnosed with psychosis by saying that our needs are not the same as your needs. To be more precise, our needs are special needs. And once our needs are identified as special needs, the circle of community is broken. Two segregated circles are formed, and importantly, systems of care get built on this fractured foundation, resulting in the very widespread notion that those of us diagnosed with psychosis are special people who have special needs, who require placement in special places with special services that are administered by specialists, right? And right now I'm channeling my friend, editor of Mouth Magazine, Lucy Gwynn. Yet this idea of systems of care is actually, of course, an oxymoron. Systems cannot care. Only people can care. This is an actual organizational chart that I found during one of my historical explorations at a state hospital here in the United States. It's built on the fractured foundations of us and them, and we can see, therefore, the complex hierarchies, chains of command, and then finally, at the very bottom, that would be the patient right about here. And in such systems, where the vast amount of resources are far removed from the voice and the choice of the individual, help itself can become unhelpful. Help itself can become toxic help. And that's how it's possible to literally be drowning in help in mental health systems. Scott Chambers, who was formerly a cartoonist with Mouth Magazine, helps us to understand. In a series called Drowning in Help, we see a person in the water shouting, "Help." Someone throws the person a wheelchair. It sinks, and the person in distress, of course, sinks along with it. Drowning in Help number 2, again, a person in the water waving their hands and shouting, "Help." And once again, there is a mismatch between the help that is offered by the system and what the person needs. And this time, money is tossed down and the person drowns as the money floats on by. And then finally, help. Again, a mismatch between what the person needs and what the system offers. A report on drowning is tossed down and sinks the person yet again. So the moral of the story, perhaps there are too many reports on drowning, and perhaps there aren't enough life preservers, but also when help is too far removed from the voice and the choice of the individual, help can become unhelpful. And it was into such a system that I was admitted when I experienced my first episode of psychosis at the age of 17. At that time, I was a senior at Marshfield High School here in Massachusetts. I came from a large Irish Catholic working class family. I was a really good athlete, and I was not at all interested in academics at the time. So I kept that perfect C- grade point average you needed in order to play varsity sports. And that's just a sort of a thumbnail of who I was as a young person. My big hope and my big dream for my life at that time was to become a coach in women's athletics. And I wanted essentially to make a living having a good time playing sports. But then came the winter break between Christmas and New Year's, we were having basketball practice while we were out of school, and I remember distinctly being on the basketball court, and the first thing that was strange that began to happen was I began to, in a sense, lose my sense of depth perception. I became very uncoordinated. I had trouble judging where I was sort of in space in relation to my friends on the team. I was becoming clumsy and not being able to execute plays and drills and feeling literally kind of lost in space. My proprioception sort of seemed changing and morphing into something where any kind of the functional use of a bleacher seat was sort of lost to me, and all I was present to were these geometric angles, the square at the end of the long bleacher seat, which seemed sharp and threatening toward me, as if the physiognomy of things were changing. My coach noticed quickly, told me to go into the locker room. We chalked it up to a bad night's sleep, and the days began to progress. And as those days began to progress, I began to hear very distressing voices that said cruel and humiliating things about me. And the thing about these voices is that they had the capacity to grab me viscerally, grab me by the gut. So they didn't need to be really loud. Because of this affective resonance, this capacity to grab me by the gut and not let go. And in those very early days, I had a sense of being engulfed by them. That's not so much true anymore, as I've learned a lot of strategies for managing distressing voices. But in the beginning, I was pretty overwhelmed by them. And then as things evolved from there, I had a lot of younger brothers and sisters. They were getting frightened of me. I would barricade myself in bedroom in the house, and just really became increasingly concerned that the folks around me might not be who they were pretending to be, perhaps. I didn't know quite what was going on, but I found it scary. And so an example I'll share would be like my mother standing there talking to me, and instead of being able to attend to what she was saying to me, I was present to the fact that flat-headed screwdrivers had replaced her teeth. And I wasn't sure how that had happened, but I knew it wasn't a good thing. So you won't be surprised that in time I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital as a minor. I was briefly interviewed on the psychiatric unit in front of a room full of psychiatry residents at a rounds. And then I was given antipsychotic medications for the very first time. So there I was, diagnosed now and receiving antipsychotics at the hospital. And the very next thing I knew, 3 days had passed. 3 days had passed. And that's when I awoke in a bed in a room in a psychiatric hospital. And I'm going to share with you, I'll never forget that experience of awakening for the very first time after having been out for 3 days, my very first awakening on an antipsychotic medication. It left such an impression on me that a few years after I experienced it, I was still writing about it in a journal. And I want to share with you what it is that I wrote way back there as a teenager in one of my journals about what it was like to awaken for the very first time on an antipsychotic. So here's what I wrote. For 3 days, I have laid pasted to this hospital bed in a drugged and dreamless sleep. I am some Christ, broken and laid into a therapeutic exhaustion where dreams do not speak of resurrection. Small rivers of spittle leak and string onto my chest, and my arms are too drugged and stiff to reach up and wipe off the shame of it. A tear of what's left of me crawls down my face and genuflects into the humiliation of it all. Once my body could move with grace and youth, but now some old woman has crawled into these bones, and they're nothing more than arthritic crutches propping me up on some bed that is not mine. So this was, again, my experience of waking up for the first time on an antipsychotic. And the thing that I want to emphasize for you is that I was completely alone in this experience. And the reason is because, for instance, the nurses who surrounded me were continually telling me how good the meds were for me, and that they reassured me that these medicines would help me return to normal. My parents were visibly relieved that I was on medicine. My treatment team said that I would need to take these medications for the rest of my life, and everyone kept telling me about how important it was for me to remain compliant with these medicines and to avoid stress. But in an extraordinary way, nobody asked me about me, or should I say, me on medicine, because it's widely assumed that psych meds in time return us to normal, return us to our regular, usual pre-psychotic self. So there's the me that I know before psychosis, the athlete, lots of energy, little love of schoolwork, and all the rest. That was regular me, or just Pat. And then came these strange and frightening experiences that got diagnosed as psychosis. And when I was administered antipsychotics, people assumed that I would eventually return to regular me. But I did not return simply to regular me. Instead, my experience was that a third state emerged. And I call this third state me on medicine. And me on medicine was a me I did not recognize. And I did not recognize myself that day or in the weeks or the months to come. And yet the people around me continued to reassure me that meds were working. And even after discharge, when I'd go to the ambulatory care clinic for monthly psych med checkups, the discordance, or this gap between my experience and my clinical team's view, continued to widen. For instance, I would say, I feel sedated. And my team point would be, but Ms. Deegan, when you take these meds, you're not psychotic. My experience was I still hear distressing voices. My team's perspective was, well, Ms. Deegan, when you're on these meds, you're not shouting at your voices anymore. My perspective was, I can't think clearly on these meds. Their perspective was, you are less thought disordered. My experience was, I feel like the meds are controlling me. And I would be corrected, no, when you're on these meds, you are more in control, Ms. Deegan. I'm not myself anymore when I'm on these meds, but Ms. Deegan, you've returned to baseline. You see, my team's goal here, was to slow the progression of what they understood as a neurodegenerative chronic illness, schizophrenia. And that at the time I was diagnosed with chronic undifferentiated schizophrenia, and it would be through symptom suppression that they could halt the progression of the disorder. But my goal was that I wanted to go to school, right? And that I wanted to learn how to coach women's athletics teams, right? So you can see the gap representing the discordance between my experience and my team's view. There's a kind of epistemic supremacy in the clinical worldview here, where my experience is subjugated to the privileged perspective of my team and what was truly important. And in all of this time, if you can imagine, nobody ever asked me, is this medicine working for you? Nobody asked me that simple question. No one ever asked me about my goal for treatment with medication, or how I wanted medicine to help me. So what this led to was a kind of disabling, now not from psychosis, but from the antipsychotic treatment itself. Now, I used to say, in the early days when people would ask, I think the cure is worse than the disorder. I think the cure is worse than the disorder. And so that led to my spending many months in a life in what I call a life in handicaptivity. And what was extraordinary about this life in handicaptivity is that by all measures, my clinical team saw me as a treatment success, I was stabilized, then I was maintained, and that by the metrics that are still used today for our work, I was called a treatment success because of reduced cost, no longer using high-end emergency departments, etc., reduced recidivism, and increased community tenure. Okay, but at the same time, I had gained significant amount of weight on the medications. I had picked up cigarette smoking, and I basically didn't have a life anymore. So my doctor said that I was lucky to be living outside the hospital, but I felt I wasn't really living at all. My clinical team was pleased with my progress, but my experience was living in a kind of chemical restraint that created walls that were as thick and impenetrable as any institution, leaving me isolated from my world and alienated from myself. And my point is that being on too much or too many medications can be a type of prison, a type of chemical incarceration without due process. I felt like that guy, right, in the cartoon. I was drowning in help that was drowning me. I was that tiny patient at the bottom of the big org chart, surrounded by care that didn't seem to care about me and my perspectives and my dreams for my life. So this was help that was not really helpful. And so eventually I decided to throw the meds away and go camping with some friends. For me, rejecting the antipsychotic was an act of resilience. For me, it was an act of defiance. For me, rejecting the antipsychotic was a way to reject a chronic diagnosis, chronic undifferentiated schizophrenia. I rejected chemical hibernation as a lifestyle. I rejected a prognosis and life of handicaptivity. I wanted to live my life, not my diagnosis. I needed to find help that was helpful, and I truly don't think I was alone in this experience. So the question becomes, how do we make help helpful? And I believe the answer is ultimately and simply to bring the voice and the choice of each individual to the center of the care team so that help becomes co-created. And then in order to do this, given the complexities of our systems of care at this time, I believe that we must have authentic paid peer support at all levels of the system, because a key role of peer supporters, a peer specialist, is to bring the unfolding narrative and understanding of the individual to the center of the team. Okay, that authentic peer support is not driving the county van and delivering talk screens back to the clinic. That's not authentic peer support, okay? I've been experimenting with peer support specialists being located in what I call decision support centers, right there in psychiatric medication clinics around the country. And so this is a shot of some of the peer support works. And part of the reason I think it's so important to have peer supporters, peer specialists who are paid for their work within psychiatric medication clinics is because of the experiences that I went through. And I think that peer supporters can make a tremendous contribution in helping individuals' voice and choice come to the center of the medical care team, right? And so I've developed techniques that can be used by peer specialists in these settings. And the one I want to share with you today is what I call power statements. Power statements have a simple formula. I want you to help me find medicine, right, that will blank so that I can blank. And here's how it works. I want you to help me find a medicine that will help me sleep, get sleep at night so that I can get up on time for car detailing training program. But the meds can't make my hands shake because then I can't detail cars. So the power of power statements is to connect the team's medication plan with what matters to me, our shared understanding of the goal of my treatment. That's the N of 1 study. That's how we know treatment is helpful. My power statement. I want you to help me find a medicine that will help my voices quiet down so that I can pay attention to my boy when I have him on weekends. Again, power statements, peer specialists, helping people develop power statements before they see the psychiatric care provider so that the psychiatric care plan is connected to and focused on our shared understanding of the goal of my treatment. One more. I want to work together to find a medicine that will help me focus and pay attention so that I can play 10 cards at bingo like I used to and win some cash prizes. Again, connecting the care plan with our shared understanding of the goal of treatment. If treatment is not helping me achieve and get to the life I want, get to 10 cards at bingo, then care has not been successful yet. What I love about power statements is it shifts the whole system from what's the matter to what matters to me. And that, my friends, is help that can be helpful. Other things that mattered in my recovery journey, hope. This is my grandmother, Margaret O'Donnell. I don't know where I'd be without my nanny. I mean, an extraordinary woman. I would sit there in handy captivity in my family's living room, smoking cigarettes, drinking high-test Coca-Cola, and staring off into space, yellow nicotine-stained fingers and lips, and just every day the tedium of anguish of going nowhere, having no reason to get up in the morning, etc. And so it was a cycle of hopelessness that I was in. But each and every day, this woman came into my smoke-filled reality. And she would say, Patricia, would you like to go food shopping? And I would say, no. And she would leave, right? She would leave. But she'd come back the next day. And importantly, she didn't come in 10 times a day because that would have been nagging me and I would have shut her right down, right? No. You want to go food shopping? It was as if each day she was coming into my smoke-filled reality and saying, Patricia, there's a world out here. It's a world that can be for you, but I can't carry you over the threshold into that world. You have to take that step yourself. Come, let's go food shopping. Well, I'm pleased to say, and I'm blessed to say, I think, that one day I accepted her invitation. And I don't know why. I don't know why that day and not 3 months earlier. I don't know. Maybe that's part of the mystery at the heart of the recovery resilient process, right? But one day I said yes. I added the caveat that I would only push the cart. I wouldn't put a damn thing in it. And that was the first active step that I took in my recovery, pushing a cart, the shopping cart down the aisle of the A&P supermarket. Why was my grandmother so successful in ways that no one else had been to that point? Because I think that invitation, that reminder, that invitation to step over the threshold into a world that could be for me was hope in action. Okay? People need a sense of hope. People need a sense of hope that I can get to a life that is meaningful for me, that is important to me, but that I need sometimes for people to invite me into that world because I can't hold the hope. I couldn't at the time hold the hope for myself. Another thing that was key to my recovery is having a reason to get up in the morning. I remember after I was readmitted to a psychiatric hospital for the third time and coming back to the medication clinic on an outpatient basis and getting lectured on lacking insight into my illness and the need to stay on my meds and on and on. And I stepped outside of the psychiatrist's office when we were done, and I remember a thought came to me. And the thought that came to me, just like, I don't know, it just came into my mind like an epiphany. I'm going to become Dr. Deegan and I'm going to change the mental health system so no one ever gets hurt in it again this way. And that's the beauty of being an adolescent. You get to think those gigantic dreams, right? It was a wonderful dream. And it became a powerful motivator. It became rocket fuel. You know, it became a response to the indignity. It was the resurgence of my dignity. I'm a person, not an illness. I'm going to change this situation so no one else has to go through with it. Having a reason to get up in the morning makes all the difference in the world and is part of what makes help helpful. I stumbled into self-care. If you can believe it, months and months and months after these hospitalizations, still no one had ever mentioned to me that there was something I could do to help myself. No one mentioned that. It was an extraordinary thing. Well, some of you may not recognize this old silver beauty, but it's called a Sony Walkman. This thing is a portable personal music player that plays analog tapes that you can mix yourself and wear a private headset, and kind of an extraordinary invention. It was given to me as a gift. And so for me, one day I'm sitting in that smoke-filled room still, even though I was going food shopping, and even though I had a dream or a mission of what I wanted to do to get, I still wasn't really doing much. I sat there, and the voices were tormenting me again, and I just picked up the headset and put it on and listened to my favorite tunes, and oh my gosh, it was extraordinary. Like the earth moved under my feet. It made a difference. It made it easier for me to focus on the music, not so much on the voices. That was amazing. These all-knowing, all-powerful, all-seeing voices. Suddenly I did something. I had efficacy. There was something I could do. I had some power, right? So this is a very, very powerful discovery. And as I look back on that discovery and the many more that followed, I realized that in those early days, I was waiting to get cured, but that actually waiting around to get cured was actually a trap that was leading to a downward spiral away from my recovery. So here's what the spiral was like. I have a biochemical brain imbalance that needs to be balanced. So every month I go to a psychiatrist who prescribes meds to balance my brain biochemistry, and then I go home and wait for my biochemistry to get balanced, but the meds don't work and I get even more depressed. So I go back to my psychiatrist who tweaks my meds because I have a biochemical brain imbalance. And so it went on week after week after week. Then something remarkable happens. The Sony Walkman, and I discover that if I attend to my music, when I'm hearing distressing voices, guess what? I'm able to be less frightened and actually substitute enjoying music for being tyrannized by these voices, this sense that there was something I could do. Well, over time, I've come to call that something personal medicine, the things I do to be well, not what I take, but the things that I do to be well. And so for me, this idea of the Sony Walkman, I went in and I told my psychiatrist, you won't believe it. And I tell him about the Sony Walkman and that it helps me to manage, these voices. And he was interested. Importantly, critically, he was interested in that. And so he says, well, let's see what happens if we begin to lower the meds. And so we do. And as we began to lower the antipsychotics, what happened was I had some more energy. When I had more energy, I was able to exercise more. When I was able to exercise more, I was able to meditate and to pray. And when I could meditate and pray, of course, that gave me a more grounded sense of self, right? And so on. And it was a cascading effect of the power of my personal medicine. So obviously, for me, this was a key insight in my recovery process. And that's why today we're working hard in my little small but mighty company to develop certified personal medicine coaches from around the world. And part of what we do is help people discover and celebrate that natural resilience, that healer within. Help people understand that for many, finding the right balance between a pharmaceutical medicine that we may use and our personal medicine sometimes can open a pathway into recovery. And part of what we're doing is collecting personal medicines, again, what I do, not what I take. And so here's an example. This is Sean. He was running into some real fearful thoughts that were dominating him, and he couldn't shake these thoughts. He was diagnosed with early psychosis at college, had been doing well for a while, but really struggling. And so eventually he stopped attending classes and was beginning to have some, isolation and actually making things worse. So Sean worked with a certified personal medicine coach and was able to explore a particular strategy, again, that comes from the lived experience of those of us who've struggled with what get diagnosed as delusions. And so they explored together this personal medicine card for troublesome beliefs. And he said the front side of the card says, remind myself that things are not always what they seem to be. And then the card also says, no matter how many times we look at this illusion, the middle line always seems longer. But that's a false perception. All the lines are the same length. Sometimes our brain can trick us, right? And then on the back of the card, and this is where the power comes from, is that Sean began to personalize this personal medicine. And he says, I'm going to use this personal medicine when I'm noticing patterns of yellow and black cars. It could be random. The patterns might not be what they appear to be. He tries it out for a while and works with his peer specialist, and then discovers that it helps me calm down and feel less scared when I see the patterns. So in terms of taking this idea of personal medicine out into some of the critical care settings that we are when people are experiencing heightened challenges and crises, one of the things that I think is critically important to do is to ask people, what do you already know how to do that helps? There's a widespread assumption that those of us diagnosed with psychosis are passively suffering from it. But the truth is we are actively trying to cope with it, trying to manage it, trying to work with it, trying to see through, around, or under it, right? What do you already know how to do that helps? Helps us co-create what has a better chance of working together. In closing, and just a final thought, we partner with people diagnosed with psychosis at that juncture where individual biology meets individual biography and the unfolding story of self. That, my friends, is where the hope is. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to the folks and Jason, and thank you.